Hey guys. Settle here. Tonight, we begin with a place people imagine incorrectly. Which, to be fair, describes most of history. But few places have been misunderstood with quite as much confidence as the Ottoman Harem. When most people hear the word harem, they picture silk cushions, perfumed air, idle luxury, and women fainting artistically near fountains for absolutely no administrative reason. It is a comforting image. It is also almost entirely wrong. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy slow, calm history that gently dismantles popular myths while you fall asleep. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see how far this quiet corner of the internet stretches. Now dim the lights. Settle in. And let's drift into one of the most politically dangerous spaces in early modern history. The Ottoman harem was not a pleasure palace. It was an institution. A bureaucratic, structured, heavily regulated extension of imperial authority. If it helps, imagine a government ministry. Now remove the filing cabinets. Add marble courtyards. Add fountains. Add silk. Add the future of the empire. And then raise the stakes so high that one careless sentence could alter succession. That was the harem. It existed inside the imperial palace complex, most famously within Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, physically close to the Sultan, yet separated from the outside world. But separation did not mean isolation. It meant control. The word harem itself simply means forbidden or private. It referred to protected domestic space. In Ottoman usage, it was the imperial household. Not a fantasy lounge. Not an endless banquet. A household. And households, especially royal ones, are rarely peaceful. They are structured. Ranked. Observed. Nothing inside the harem was casual. Not movement. Not speech. Not silence. Silence had hierarchy. Even proximity had rank. Who could walk where? Who could speak first? Who could sit? Who could remain standing? Who could make eye contact? All of it meant something. And when everything means something, mistakes become expensive. The popular fantasy of the harem was largely shaped by European travelers who were not allowed inside. Which meant they did what humans reliably do when denied access to information. They imagined. They speculated. They embroidered. Travel diaries turned into gossip. Gossip hardened into assumption. Assumption became fact. And soon the harem was less an institution and more a painting, lush, sensual, morally chaotic. But the Ottomans did not build institutions for chaos. They built them to prevent it. The empire was vast. Multi-ethnic. Multilingual. Multi-religious. Its greatest political vulnerability was succession. Who would rule next? And how would that transfer of power avoid civil war? The harem existed, in part, to manage that question. Women did not simply wander into the harem because someone admired their appearance. Entry was controlled. Structured. Regulated. Many women entered as enslaved captives, purchased legally within the norms of the era. Others were gifts in diplomatic exchanges. Some were selected for intelligence and adaptability. Once inside, the fantasy ended. Immediately. New arrivals were evaluated. Not just for beauty. Beauty was common. Intelligence was rare. Temperament mattered. Memory mattered. Composure mattered. Adaptability mattered most of all. Most women inside the harem would never meet the Sultan in private. Ever. They were assigned duties. They were ranked. They served higher-ranking women. They managed internal operations. This was not a continuous competition for affection. It was a hierarchy. Structured and watched. Education began quickly. Languages. Religion. Court etiquette. Music. Poetry. Calligraphy. Protocol. Not because these were charming hobbies. Because ignorance was dangerous. If you misunderstood a rule, you did not receive gentle correction. You were remembered. And memory inside the harem was a currency more valuable than gold. Everyone remembered everything. Who spoke out of turn? Who reacted too quickly? Who seemed too eager? Who seemed too cold? The greatest skill was not brilliance. It was controlled competence. Perform well. But not too well. Speak clearly. But not too boldly. Be visible. But not conspicuous. It was a narrow path. And it required patience. Because advancement was slow. Deliberate. Observed. Drawing attention too early could be fatal to relevance. Attention meant scrutiny. Scrutiny meant expectation. Expectation meant pressure. Pressure meant mistakes. And mistakes, in a court built on stability, were not easily forgiven. The women who survived longest were rarely the most dramatic. They were the most disciplined. They mastered something subtle. The art of being essential without appearing ambitious. Because ambition, when visible, invited concern. And concern, inside a palace, invited monitoring. Which was palace language for, we are watching you more closely now. The harem was not idle. It was structured waiting. Waiting for promotion. Waiting for notice. Waiting for opportunity. Waiting for decline. Time moved differently there. Slow. Measured. And deeply political. And at the top of this structure sat the most powerful woman in the empire. The Valide Sultan. The Sultan's mother. If the harem was a machine, she was its operator. Her authority inside the harem was absolute. She controlled appointments. Ranks. Allowances. Discipline. Access. Officially, she did not rule the empire. Unofficially, many political calculations began with one question. Does she approve? She did not need dramatic gestures. She did not shout. She did not threaten. She simply controlled doors. And doors, in a palace, are power. If she disapproved of someone, invitations stopped arriving. Meetings were delayed. Support cooled. By the time the target noticed, their influence had already thinned. This was governance by temperature. Warmth meant favor. Coolness meant danger. And the Valide Sultan controlled the climate. But even she operated within the greater tension of the Ottoman system. Succession. The birth of a prince was not pure joy. It was potential instability. Each son represented a future claim to the throne. Multiple claims had historically led to violence. So motherhood was not protection. It was elevation combined with exposure. A mother of a prince gained status. But she also gained rivals. Other mothers. Other factions. Officials who quietly aligned themselves with potential futures. From the moment a prince was born, politics intensified. Every tutor mattered. Every rumor mattered. Every illness mattered. If a prince appeared too ambitious, he was threatening. Too passive, and he was dismissed. The balance had to be perfect. Which meant his mother's life became strategic labor. And inside this environment, alliances formed. Quietly. Through favors. Through shared routines. Through careful memory. Servants carried information. Eunuchs controlled access. A delayed message could destroy a plan. A well-timed introduction could secure protection. Loyalty was practical. Not sentimental. Today's ally could be tomorrow's liability. The key was never appearing surprised. And then there were scandals. Or what outsiders called scandals. Inside the harem, most scandals were politics wearing dramatic clothing. Rumors were weapons. They required no proof. No confrontation. A whisper was enough. Denying a rumor gave it oxygen. Ignoring it let it grow. Either way, someone benefited. And it was rarely the accused. Poison accusations were especially effective. Illness was common in palace life. Which made suspicion easy. A sudden fever. A brief weakness. An unexpected recovery. All could be interpreted. And interpretation was power. In such an environment, emotion became expensive. Triumph had to be muted. Grief had to be measured. Anger had to be invisible. Because to be seen reacting strongly was to reveal vulnerability. And vulnerability was an invitation. The Ottoman harem was not built for indulgence. It was built for stability. But stability, when enforced too tightly, creates pressure. Pressure creates strategy. Strategy creates intrigue. And intrigue, centuries later, becomes legend. Yet the real story is quieter. More administrative. More psychological. Less silk. More structure. The harem did not exist for pleasure. It existed to manage access to the most powerful man in the empire. To regulate succession. To contain instability. To organize proximity. And when you place intelligent, ambitious, observant people inside a system built on surveillance and patience, you do not eliminate politics. You refine it. And that refinement, controlled, disciplined, quiet, is far more dangerous than the fantasy ever was. Now settle deeper. Because we have only just entered the outer courtyard. And beyond it lies the daily rhythm of the harem itself. We move now past the outer corridors, past the guarded thresholds, into the daily rhythm of the imperial harem, not the imagined one, but the real one. Morning inside the harem did not begin with leisure. It began with order. The call to prayer drifted through the palace complex before sunrise, soft but insistent. Even in private quarters, routine aligned with faith. Women rose, washed, dressed according to rank. Fabrics differed. Colors differed. Embroidery signaled hierarchy. Nothing was random. Rank determined space. Space determined movement. Movement determined visibility. And visibility, as we now understand, determined risk. The lowest-ranking women, often newly arrived, performed domestic tasks. Cleaning. Organizing garments. Preparing baths. Carrying trays. Observing everything. Because even the lowest position inside the harem came with one silent expectation: pay attention. Attention was survival. The harem was divided into sections. Dormitories for novices. Apartments for favored women. Separate quarters for mothers of princes. Administrative spaces. Instruction rooms. Private courtyards enclosed by high walls that ensured privacy without eliminating scrutiny. At the center of it all, access routes. Corridors mattered. Doors mattered. Timing mattered. And controlling those routes were the palace eunuchs. Particularly the chief black eunuch, the Kisler Agassi, one of the most powerful figures in the empire. He controlled communication between the harem and the outside political world. Petitions passed through him. Messages passed through him. Requests for audiences passed through him. If the sultan was the sun, the eunuchs were the atmosphere. They determined what reached him. And what burned up before arrival. Their authority was practical, not theatrical. They scheduled. They escorted. They monitored. They remembered. Inside the harem, women navigated both official hierarchy and informal networks. A typical day for a young trainee might involve hours of instruction. Language lessons. Memorization of court etiquette. Practice in music, the oud, the canon, soft rhythmic patterns meant not for performance halls but for intimate court settings. Calligraphy exercises, precision of hand reflecting discipline of mind. Religion was not optional. It shaped conduct, speech, posture. One learned not only what to say, but when silence was superior. And silence, inside the harem, was an art form. Not passive. Active. Measured. There were meals, of course. Shared at assigned levels. Seating reflected status. Conversation remained careful. Laughter, if too loud, lingered in memory. Even joy required moderation. Because nothing suggested instability faster than excess. It is important to understand something subtle here. The harem did not run on constant visible tension. It ran on anticipation. Anticipation of favor. Anticipation of change. Anticipation of opportunity. Which meant that patience was cultivated like a discipline. Some women would spend years without significant advancement. Years. And yet the system did not collapse under frustration. Why? Because small promotions mattered. A change in quarters. An increase in allowance. Permission to supervise others. Tiny increments of recognition. Enough to maintain hope. Hope is stabilizing. But hope was also strategic. Those who appeared too eager were noted. Those who appeared indifferent were also noted. Balance was everything. And then there were the rare moments when the Sultan's attention entered the equation. Contrary to fantasy, the Sultan did not wander freely through the harem selecting companions on impulse. Meetings were arranged. Suggested. Filtered. Sometimes initiated through recommendation. Sometimes through performance, music, poetry, demonstrated composure. If a woman was summoned, the entire structure noticed. Not openly. Never openly. But eyes shifted. Servants observed. Other women recalculated. Attention was not romance. It was leverage. And leverage altered alliances. A woman who received repeated summons might gain influence. But she also gained surveillance. Her behavior was studied more carefully. Her words weighed more heavily. Because proximity to power is contagious. It changes how others treat you. And how they prepare for your possible fall. For fall was always possible. Favor fluctuated. The Sultan himself was not immune to political pressure. Advisors influenced. Mothers influenced. The Valide Sultan influenced most of all. And sometimes, removing someone from favor was less about emotion and more about balance. Too much influence in one corner destabilized the structure. So adjustments were made. Quietly. Reassignments occurred. Rooms changed. Invitations ceased. Not dramatically. Not cruelly. Simply, less frequently. And inside a world built on proximity, distance was exile. Beyond the internal politics of companionship lay the greater political function of the harem, succession. In earlier centuries of the Ottoman Empire, succession had often been brutal. When a sultan died, his sons competed. Historically, this sometimes meant fratricide, the execution of rival brothers to prevent civil war. It was harsh. It was rationalized as necessary for stability. Later reforms attempted to reduce this bloodshed. Princes were confined in what became known as the kafes, the cage. Not a literal iron cage. But controlled isolation within the palace. Princes were kept in restricted quarters, away from military command, away from public life. Protected. Contained. This system reduced immediate fratricide. But it introduced another problem. Princes grew up inexperienced. Unexposed to governance. Isolated. Which meant that when one eventually ascended the throne, he might lack preparation. And who, then, guided him? Often his mother. Which returns us to the Valide Sultan. Her position was not symbolic. It was operational. She oversaw finances within the harem. She approved promotions. She mediated disputes. She ensured stability. If factions grew tense, she redirected energy. If rumors escalated, she intervened. Not publicly. Public drama suggested weakness. She preferred correction through access. Through influence. Through subtle redirection. And outside the palace walls, the empire continued expanding, negotiating, fighting, taxing, building. But inside the harem, time moved differently. Measured by pregnancies. By illnesses. By deaths. By promotions. By the slow aging of faces once new. A woman who had entered at 15 might find herself 35 and suddenly categorized differently. Youth was political capital. But age was authority. Those who survived long enough acquired a different kind of influence. Memory became their asset. They remembered who had risen too quickly. Who had fallen too dramatically. Who had once whispered what? Institutional memory is power. And the harem had an extraordinary memory. The European fantasy painted the harem as indulgent and chaotic. In truth, it was one of the most structured environments in the empire. It existed to regulate desire. To channel ambition. To manage proximity. To stabilize succession. But structure does not eliminate human emotion. It compresses it. And compressed emotion becomes strategy. Not loud. Not reckless. Strategic. As evening approached, the palace shifted again. Oil lamps glowed along tiled corridors. The call to prayer echoed once more. Courtyards cooled. Whispers softened. And somewhere inside those walls, someone evaluated their day. Did I speak too much? Did I remain too quiet? Did I align correctly? Did I reveal too little? Or too much? Because inside the Ottoman harem, survival was not dramatic. It was incremental. Small decisions layered over years. And the most powerful weapon was rarely beauty. It was restraint. Now rest a little deeper. Because next, we move beyond daily routine. Into the mechanics of alliance. We move now into something less visible than rank and more powerful than beauty. Alliances. If you imagine the Ottoman harem as a place where women competed individually, you are only seeing the surface. No one survived alone. And no one trusted completely. Alliances inside the harem were not dramatic. There were no whispered vows beneath moonlit arches. No solemn declarations of loyalty. That would have been reckless. Instead, alliances formed the way water reshapes stone. Slowly. Repeatedly. Through routine. A shared lesson. A small favor. A warning delivered at the right moment. An introduction made quietly. Nothing overt. Nothing that could be quoted later. Because inside the harem, anything that could be quoted could be used. A newly arrived woman learned quickly that her survival depended not only on pleasing superiors, but on managing equals. Peers were the most dangerous rivals. They observed your habits. They measured your tone. They noticed when your name was mentioned more often than usual. So friendships, if they existed, were practical. Two women might share information. Exchange small protections. Cover minor mistakes. But even then, the alliance was conditional. Because circumstances shifted. And the harem rewarded flexibility. At the center of these networks stood the servants. Often overlooked in romantic retellings. Never overlooked inside the palace. Servants carried trays. But they also carried knowledge. Who had visitors? Who had been summoned? Who had waited? Who had left disappointed? Information flowed downward before it flowed upward. A woman who treated servants with kindness did not guarantee loyalty. But she reduced resentment. And resentment, in a closed system, fermented quickly. Then there were the eunuchs. Not simply guards. Administrators. Gatekeepers. Schedulers of proximity. The chief black eunuch held one of the most sensitive positions in the empire. He managed communication between the harem and the sultan. Which meant he influenced timing. And timing, in politics, is everything. A message delivered too late might ruin an opportunity. A message delivered early might create one. A request forwarded. A request delayed. A rumor acknowledged. A rumor quietly ignored. These were not minor decisions. They shaped outcomes. Women inside the harem understood this. Maintaining respectful, stable relations with eunuchs was not manipulation. It was infrastructure. An alliance with someone who controlled doors was never declared. It was maintained through consistency. Predictability. Reliability. Because unpredictability made everyone nervous. And nervous people protect themselves first. Alliances were tested constantly. A minor scandal. An illness. A sudden shift in favor. These moments revealed who defended whom. Who remained silent. Who distanced themselves at the first hint of instability. Silence itself could signal alignment. To speak was risky. To remain silent could be strategic. The most powerful alliances were the least visible. Two women who rarely stood together in public. Three who never appeared to coordinate. And yet when tension rose, their reactions aligned perfectly. These networks did not eliminate rivalry. They managed it. They created buffers. They distributed risk. Because risk, inside the harem, was inevitable. And then came the most volatile force of all. Motherhood. When a woman gave birth to a son, the geometry of alliances shifted instantly. She was no longer simply another member of the hierarchy. She was a potential mother of a future sultan. Her quarters improved. Her resources increased. Her visibility intensified. And so did her danger. Other mothers recalculated. Officials observed. Servants paid closer attention. A prince was not merely a child. He was a political trajectory. And trajectories collided. Mothers of princes could not afford isolation. They needed networks. Support among eunuchs. Support among tutors. Support among administrators. Because raising a prince was not simply nurturing a child. It was shaping a future ruler while avoiding suspicion. A prince who appeared too strong invited fear. Too weak invited dismissal. Too independent suggested ambition. Too dependent suggested incompetence. And every impression reflected on his mother. Motherhood inside the harem was political labor. Carefully managed appearances. Measured grief when illness struck. Controlled pride when progress was noted. Too much emotion, in any direction, invited interpretation. And interpretation could become accusation. If a prince fell ill, whispers began. If he recovered too quickly, whispers continued. Poison was often suspected. Whether or not it existed. Because poisoning accusations were perfect political tools. Difficult to prove. Impossible to disprove conclusively. A fever became intrigue. A delayed recovery became narrative. The harem did not need open violence to remain tense. It needed uncertainty. And uncertainty was abundant. Yet despite this constant evaluation, life inside the harem was not perpetual chaos. It was structured pressure. Like a sealed chamber. Everything controlled. Everything regulated. Until small cracks appeared. A dismissed servant. A reassigned tutor. An invitation that did not arrive. These minor shifts signaled deeper adjustments. The Valide Sultan monitored all of it. She did not intervene in every conflict. Only the ones that threatened equilibrium. Her authority rested not on emotional dominance, but on institutional continuity. She had survived long enough to understand something crucial. Ambition burns fast. Structure endures. Women who rose too quickly often fell dramatically. Women who advanced gradually tended to last. The harem rewarded those who understood time. Who could wait without appearing impatient? Who could advance without appearing ambitious? Who could retreat without appearing defeated? And above all, those who could endure attention without depending on it. Because attention fluctuated. Favor cooled. The Sultan's interests shifted. Political needs changed. And those who built their identity entirely on proximity often found themselves adrift when that proximity vanished. The women who survived longest were rarely the most dazzling. They were the most adaptable. They adjusted tone. Adjusted posture. Adjusted alliances. Without appearing inconsistent. Which is perhaps the most sophisticated skill of all. Consistency of appearance. Flexibility of strategy. As night settled over the palace, oil lamps flickered along tiled corridors. Soft footsteps echoed across marble. Some women slept peacefully. Some lay awake recalculating. Some reviewed conversations in their minds. Did I reveal too much? Did I align correctly? Did I miss an opportunity? Because inside the Ottoman harem, no day was insignificant. Every interaction accumulated. Every silence recorded. And over years, those small accumulations shaped destinies. The harem was not a fantasy of indulgence. It was a machine of patience. Of discipline. Of strategic restraint. And like all machines built to manage power, it generated stories. Stories outsiders turned into scandal. Stories insiders understood as survival. Now we come to the most delicate shift of all. Not the gaining of favor. The losing of it. Because inside the Ottoman harem, rise was visible. But decline was quiet. And quiet decline was far more dangerous. When a woman first received the Sultan's attention, the change was subtle but unmistakable. Her quarters improved. Her garments refined. Her allowance adjusted. Servants treated her with a new degree of precision. Other women measured their responses carefully. But the harem had seen this before. Many times. Attention was not permanence. It was weather. And weather changes. The first sign of cooling favor was rarely dramatic. An invitation that did not arrive. A scheduled appearance postponed. A message delivered with polite delay. No announcement. No confrontation. Simply, absence. An absence inside a system built on proximity carried weight. A woman who had once been summoned frequently might now wait. And waiting, in a place defined by visibility, was a slow erosion. The most painful part was not the loss itself. It was the reaction of others. Those who had aligned themselves closely began to adjust their distance. Not rudely. Never rudely. With perfect manners. But a subtle recalibration. Conversations shortened. Visits became less frequent. Support grew, measured. Because no one wanted to be associated too tightly with declining influence. Association was currency. And currency must be protected. The woman herself had to respond flawlessly. Too much visible disappointment signaled instability. Too much indifference signaled ingratitude. The correct response lay somewhere between dignified calm and quiet usefulness. Continue performing duties. Continue observing protocol. Continue existing as if nothing had changed. Because sometimes favor returned. And visible resentment could destroy that possibility. But often, it did not return. And here we see the true discipline of the harem. Removal was rarely explosive. It was administrative. A reassignment to a different palace. A transfer to provincial residence. A reduction in allowance. Not exile in chains. Exile in comfort. Comfortable irrelevance. The Ottoman system preferred stability. Public drama disrupted stability. So decline was softened. Managed. Absorbed. Which made it more psychologically complex. There was no final confrontation. No closure. Only adjustment. And adjustment required extraordinary emotional control. This is where the fantasy collapses completely. There were no operatic confrontations beneath fountains. No shattered goblets. No theatrical accusations. If accusations arose, they were handled through channels. Investigated quietly. Resolved without spectacle whenever possible. Because spectacle invited weakness. And weakness invited external threats. The empire could not afford that. Even the Sultan's attention was influenced by politics. He was not simply an individual man choosing companions freely. He was a ruler balancing factions. Military leaders. Advisors. His mother. His own security. If favor toward one woman threatened balance among powerful groups, adjustments followed. Not always because of personal displeasure. Sometimes because of strategic necessity. This is an important truth. Inside the harem, personal emotion was rarely the only variable. Power was always in the room. And power required equilibrium. Those who understood this survived. Those who mistook affection for security often did not. Then there were the women who chose not to rise too far. This is perhaps the most misunderstood strategy of all. Advancement increased visibility. Visibility increased risk. A woman might intentionally remain competent but unremarkable. Useful. Steady. Present. But never the center of attention. This position allowed longevity. Longevity allowed influence of a quieter kind. Advisory roles. Supervision of younger women. Institutional memory. These women became anchors. They had seen cycles. They knew how quickly enthusiasm cooled. And how swiftly alliances shifted. They learned to measure their words not by immediate effect, but by long-term safety. In time, the harem reshaped identity itself. You did not simply act carefully. You became careful. You did not simply monitor your expression. Your expression became measured. Years of surveillance internalized observation. Even alone, women corrected posture. Adjusted tone. Because the habit of being evaluated never fully disappeared. And perhaps that is the most profound legacy of the harem. It was not only a political institution. It was a psychological one. It trained people to anticipate judgment. To correct themselves before correction arrived. To live inside invisible boundaries. And call that discipline virtue. Outside the palace walls, wars were fought. Treaties signed. Borders shifted. Inside the harem, power moved differently. Through rooms. Through whispers. Through doors that opened slightly later than expected. And at the center of it all, the Valide Sultan continued her slow governance. She understood decline better than anyone. She had witnessed generations rise and fall. She knew which tensions required intervention. Which conflicts would resolve themselves. Which alliances were temporary. Her power did not depend on novelty. It depended on continuity. In a world where attention flickered, she remained constant. And that constancy was its own form of dominance. Now the lamps burn low. The corridors are still. Somewhere inside the palace, a woman who once mattered greatly lies awake, recalculating her future. Somewhere else, a younger woman measures her own ambition carefully, deciding how visible she can afford to become. Because in the Ottoman harem, nothing was ever entirely secure. Not beauty. Not favor. Not even motherhood. Only structure endured. And those who learned to move within it, quietly, patiently, precisely, left the deepest mark. Rest a little deeper. Because next, we move beyond the palace walls. To how the outside world misunderstood all of this. And why that misunderstanding lasted for centuries. Let the night deepen. Because now we step outside the palace, and into imagination. For centuries, the Ottoman harem became less a place and more a fantasy. European travelers returned with stories. Painters filled canvases with reclining figures draped in silk. Writers described perfumed chambers and idle women waiting for pleasure. But these images said more about the outsiders than about the harem itself. The West, particularly in the 18th and 19th centuries, was fascinated by the Orient. Exoticism sold. Mystery sold. Sensuality sold even better. Artists like Jean-Léon Gérôme and Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres created scenes of imagined harems, languid women, marble baths, golden light, indolent luxury. But most of these painters had never entered an Ottoman imperial harem. They were constructing desire. Projecting fantasy onto a closed institution. The result was a powerful distortion. The harem became shorthand for decadence. For moral excess. For tyranny disguised as pleasure. And this distortion served political purposes. If the Ottoman Empire could be framed as indulgent and corrupt, then European powers could frame themselves as rational and superior. Art became argument. Paintings became propaganda. And slowly, myth hardened into assumed truth. Even literature followed the pattern. Writers such as Lord Byron filled poems with Eastern sensuality and danger. Opera houses staged fantasies of captive maidens and cruel sultans. Audiences consumed these stories eagerly. It was spectacle without context. But here is the quiet irony. While Europe imagined chaos and indulgence inside the harem, the real institution functioned with meticulous hierarchy. While painters imagined idle bodies, the actual women were navigating education, alliances, inheritance, and survival. The fantasy was simple. The reality was structured. Why did the fantasy endure? Because it was easier. It required no understanding of Ottoman governance. No study of succession law. No recognition of women as political actors. Instead, it reduced them to symbols. And symbols are easier to manage than complexity. Even modern cinema inherited these tropes. Films portrayed jeweled rooms and whispering conspiracies, rarely showing the bureaucracy, the training, the discipline. But historians in the 20th century began re-examining archives. Letters. Court records. Financial documents. What they found was not chaos. It was system. Carefully regulated stipends. Documented promotions. Defined roles. The harem was not a pleasure dungeon. It was an administrative wing of empire. And like any administrative body, it produced both stability and tension. This shift in understanding reshaped scholarship. It forced historians to reconsider women's political agency in the Ottoman world. It led to serious study of figures like Hurrem Sultan and Kozum Sultan not as caricatures, but as strategists. Women who commissioned mosques. Funded charities. Influenced appointments. Negotiated power in ways that left architectural and diplomatic marks. The so-called Sultanate of Women was not myth. It was a period of measurable influence. But even that phrase can mislead. It suggests an anomaly. A temporary deviation. In truth, influence had always existed. It was simply more visible during certain reigns. And so the misunderstanding tells us something deeper. We often reduce unfamiliar systems to drama. We project our anxieties onto closed spaces. We mistake privacy for secrecy. And secrecy for immorality. The Ottoman harem became a mirror. Europe saw what it feared. Modern audiences see what they expect. But the archival record, the quiet ink on aging paper, tells another story. A story of training. Of restraint. Of calculated movement inside a system designed to preserve dynasty. Now, as the night settles further, imagine the palace again. Not as fantasy. Not as scandal. But as structure. Young girls learning languages and music. Senior women reviewing accounts. The Valide Sultan receiving petitions. A network of rooms functioning like a nervous system. Power circulating. Carefully. Deliberately. Outside, the empire faced wars, rebellions, negotiations. Inside, the harem ensured continuity. Because succession, the survival of the dynasty, depended on controlled reproduction, education, and protection of heirs. This was not indulgence. It was insurance. And insurance, though rarely glamorous, determined survival. By the 19th century, reforms began reshaping the empire. Western influence increased. Administrative modernization altered many institutions. The harem, too, transformed. Its political dominance faded as new governmental structures centralized authority elsewhere. But its legacy remained embedded in memory. And memory, shaped by art and literature, outlived the institution itself. Today, when we hear the word harem, many still imagine cushions and seduction. Few imagine ledgers and policy. Few imagine discipline as intense as any court bureaucracy. And yet that discipline defined daily life. So as you drift deeper into this long night story, hold both images. The imagined one, glowing with gold and fantasy. And the documented one, structured, calculated, restrained. History often lives in that tension. Between myth and record. Between painting and archive. And somewhere between them, the truth breathes quietly. We are not finished yet. Because next, we move to the most fragile part of the story. What happened when the empire itself began to weaken? And how the women of the harem faced a world that was changing beyond their walls. Now we enter the final, quiet transformation. Because institutions built for permanence rarely imagine their own ending. For centuries, the Ottoman dynasty endured wars, rebellions, assassinations, and reform. The harem adapted to each shift. It restructured hierarchy. It redefined influence. It absorbed shock. But the 19th century brought something different. Not sudden collapse. Slow erosion. Reform movements such as the Tanzimat attempted to modernize governance, law, and administration. European diplomatic pressure increased. Military defeats chipped away at imperial confidence. Authority began migrating from palace intimacy to ministerial bureaucracy. Power was moving outward. From inner chambers to state offices. The harem did not vanish overnight. It diminished gradually. New schools opened outside palace walls. Western-educated officials rose in prominence. Communication between Empire and Europe intensified. Visibility replaced seclusion in certain elite circles. And yet, inside the palace, daily rhythms continued. Lessons. Ceremonies. Carefully measured protocol. But something subtle had changed. The political weight of the harem was lighter. No longer the central arena of succession maneuvering it once had been. No longer the decisive engine of factional negotiation. It became more ceremonial than strategic. The final Ottoman sultans ruled in an age of railways and telegraphs. The world was accelerating. Secluded systems struggled to compete with open diplomacy and industrial administration. Then came war. The early 20th century brought global conflict on a scale the empire had never faced before. By the time of World War I, the Ottoman state was fighting for survival alongside its allies. Defeat followed. Occupation. Partition plans. Revolutionary currents within Anatolia. And in 1922, the unthinkable occurred. The Sultanate itself was abolished. Soon after, the Caliphate ended as well under the leadership of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. The dynasty that had ruled for over 6 centuries was dissolved. Members of the imperial family were exiled. And with that exile, the Ottoman imperial harem, as an institution, ceased to exist. Not destroyed by scandal. Not burned in uprising. But legislated into memory. The women who had lived entire lives within structured walls found themselves in foreign cities. Paris. Cairo. Nice. Beirut. Some adapted. Some struggled financially. Some faded quietly into obscurity. Their skills, court protocol, dynastic navigation, ceremonial etiquette, belonged to a world that no longer existed. It is difficult to imagine that psychological shift. To be raised in a system that promised continuity. To internalize discipline as destiny. And then to watch the entire framework dissolve. Yet history rarely grants emotional preparation. Institutions end as gradually, or as abruptly, as politics demand. Today, parts of the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul are museums. Visitors walk through chambers once governed by strict hierarchy. They admire tiles, latticework, fountains. They speak in whispers, not because of rules, but because the space feels heavy with memory. The silence is different now. No longer strategic. No longer guarded. Just historical. And perhaps that is the final transformation. A place once defined by controlled access becomes open to tourists. A system once feared becomes photographed. A word once loaded with fantasy becomes academic subject. The Ottoman harem was never merely what outsiders imagined. Nor was it entirely benevolent or gentle. It was disciplined. Strategic. Restrictive. Protective. Political. It shaped women's lives profoundly, sometimes empowering, often confining, always structured. It produced influential figures. It enforced obedience. It sustained a dynasty. And when that dynasty ended, it ended too. Not with a scream. But with a signature. If you listen carefully, the story of the harem is not about indulgence. It is about control. Control of succession. Control of access. Control of narrative. Even the myths that followed were forms of control, shaping how later generations understood the Ottoman past. And now, after these long hours, we return to stillness. Imagine one final night inside the palace before exile. Corridors dim. Servants moving softly. A valied sultan who once commanded immense influence sitting quietly, aware that history has turned. No dramatic speeches. No cinematic farewell. Just the quiet awareness that permanence was always an illusion. Empires rise. Institutions adapt. Structures harden. And eventually, even the most carefully guarded walls become memory. You have traveled through hierarchy, discipline, myth, reform, and dissolution. Through ambition and restraint. Through misunderstanding and re-evaluation. And perhaps the greatest lesson of the Ottoman harem is this. Power does not always shout. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it organizes. Sometimes it waits behind a carved wooden screen, unseen, shaping outcomes without spectacle. And when it disappears, the world barely notices, until historians begin reading the archives centuries later. Let the lamps go out now. The palace rests. The empire rests. History remains. And in that quiet, the true story lingers, not as fantasy, but as structure. Then let us not end with silence. Because even when institutions fall, their echoes remain. After exile, members of the Ottoman dynasty scattered across Europe and the Middle East. Some maintained fragments of ceremonial identity. Others married into foreign aristocracy. A few lived modestly, far removed from marble halls and guarded corridors. The habits of palace life did not disappear overnight. Posture remained upright. Speech remained measured. Hospitality remained formal. Structure, once internalized, becomes character. And so the legacy of the Ottoman harem did not vanish with its walls. It dissolved into memory, into biography, into family stories carried across borders. Meanwhile, in the new Republic of Turkey, sweeping reforms redefined public life. Secular governance replaced dynastic rule. Visibility replaced seclusion as a social ideal. Education expanded beyond elite confines. Women entered public institutions in new ways. History pivoted sharply. But pivots do not erase what came before. Scholars in the later 20th century began reassessing the imperial household with more nuance. Archival material revealed financial networks, property endowments, charitable foundations established by powerful women. Figures like Harem Sultan were no longer treated merely as romantic legend. Her mosque complexes, charitable kitchens, and correspondence became central to understanding Ottoman urban development. Kozum Sultan emerged not as a shadowy manipulator, but as a regent navigating fragile succession during volatile decades. The term, Sultanate of Women, began appearing in academic discourse, not as scandal, but as analytical framework. This re-evaluation matters. Because how we remember institutions shapes how we understand gender, power, and agency. The harem complicates easy narratives. It was restrictive, yes. But within restriction, influence existed. It was hierarchical, absolutely. But hierarchy does not erase strategy. It was secluded. But seclusion did not mean irrelevance. Modern visitors to Topkapi Palace walk through the imperial harem section with guided tours. They see tiled walls from Iznik. They see the apartments of the Valide Sultan. They see the private chambers of the Sultan. But what they cannot see is the tension that once filled those spaces. The silent calculations. The alliances formed over shared tea. The lessons memorized in low lamplight. The awareness that a single misstep could alter a lifetime. Museums preserve architecture. They cannot preserve atmosphere. And perhaps that is why myth persists. Because imagination fills the silence left by vanished voices. Yet history invites patience. It asks us to sit with complexity. To resist flattening systems into caricature. To understand that even behind carved screens and guarded doors, human lives unfolded with ambition, fear, intelligence, and resilience. The Ottoman harem was not paradise. It was not prison in the simplistic sense either. It was an institution shaped by its time, by dynastic survival, by imperial politics, by cultural norms that prioritized lineage and controlled succession. And like all institutions, it contained contradictions. Protection and confinement. Opportunity and limitation. Prestige and vulnerability. Its story stretches across 4 centuries. Across reigns of powerful sultans and uncertain heirs. Across wars, reforms, artistic flourishing, and eventual dissolution. And now, centuries later, it continues to shape how we imagine the Ottoman past. That is the final irony. An institution designed for privacy became globally famous. A system built on controlled access became one of the most publicly discussed elements of the empire. Perhaps that is history's quiet humor. The most guarded spaces often leave the loudest echoes. So if you think back to where we began, beyond the fantasy, beyond the painted fantasies of reclining figures, what remains is structure. Hierarchy. Training. Observation. A political ecosystem hidden inside domestic space. And in that hidden ecosystem, generations of women learned to navigate power without appearing to hold it. They learned to speak carefully, to wait strategically, to influence indirectly. Skills that rarely receive dramatic recognition, but skills that shape outcomes nonetheless. The palace walls no longer contain them. The dynasty no longer rules. But the questions remain relevant. How does power operate behind closed doors? How do institutions shape identity? How do narratives distort what they cannot easily access? Those questions extend far beyond the Ottoman world. They echo in every era. And that is why this story endures. Not because of silk cushions. Not because of fantasy. But because it reveals how power can exist quietly, structured, disciplined, and patient, inside spaces the outside world misunderstands. Now we truly let the lamps fade. The corridors are empty. The guards no longer stand watch. But the memory of structure, and the whisper of influence, remains in the record. And in that record, the Ottoman harem is no longer myth. It is history. Then let us go even deeper, not into events, but into meaning. Because when the walls are gone, what remains is interpretation. Every generation rewrites the Ottoman past in its own image. In the early Turkish Republic, the imperial court, including the harem, was often framed as a symbol of backwardness. Reform required contrast. The new state defined itself against dynastic excess, against seclusion, against what it portrayed as stagnation. The harem became shorthand for what we left behind. Later, Western popular culture revived the older exoticism, velvet cushions, intrigue, sensuality, because spectacle sells more easily than structure. Then academic historians intervened again, returning to archives, correcting exaggerations, restoring nuance. So the harem has lived 3 lives. First, as lived reality. Second, as exotic fantasy. Third, as historical subject. Each version reflects the needs of the era describing it. And perhaps that is the most powerful lesson of all. History is not only what happened. It is what is remembered. Inside the real harem, memory functioned differently. Women memorized genealogies. Memorized court etiquette. Memorized alliances. Memory was survival. Outside, memory became narrative. Narrative became identity. And identity became politics. Consider how rarely the daily routine is discussed compared to dramatic rumors. Routine is not thrilling. But routine sustains institutions. Dawn prayers. Language lessons. Embroidery workshops. Administrative reviews. Health inspections. Child education. Financial accounting. These ordinary rhythms kept the imperial household functioning. Without them, there is no dynasty. Without dynasty, there is no empire. The extraordinary rests on the ordinary. That truth is easy to forget when looking at gilded ceilings. And yet, when historians comb through surviving registers, they find lists. Names. Stipends. Cloth allocations. Medical expenses. Detailed, careful accounting. Not chaos. Administration. The Ottoman world was complex, multi-ethnic, multilingual. The harem reflected that diversity. Women came from different regions, the Caucasus, the Balkans, sometimes beyond. They brought languages, customs, and perspectives. Inside a controlled environment, cultural exchange occurred quietly. Cuisine blended. Music adapted. Fashion evolved. The harem was isolated, but it was not culturally stagnant. It was, in some ways, a microcosm of empire. And like the empire, it required constant balancing. Too much internal rivalry destabilized succession. Too little structure invited disorder. Too rigid hierarchy risked resentment. Balance was everything. Even the architecture reflects this principle. Private yet interconnected. Layered courtyards. Guarded gates. Rooms within rooms. Movement was guided deliberately, who could see whom, who could access which spaces. Power mapped physically. And that mapping shaped behavior. Imagine growing up in a place where every doorway has meaning. Every corridor signals rank. Every greeting confirms hierarchy. Identity forms differently there. Ambition becomes subtle. Speech becomes measured. Silence becomes tool. When the empire fell, those habits did not vanish. But the structure supporting them did. And that dissonance, between internal discipline and external modernity, must have been profound for those who experienced it. Yet history rarely preserves personal reflections in full. We glimpse fragments. Letters. Memoirs. Official decrees. The rest requires careful reconstruction. That is why myths flourish. Gaps invite imagination. But serious study resists easy drama. It asks slower questions. What did power look like when it wore domestic clothing? How did women influence policy without public office? How did privacy shape political culture? The Ottoman Harem forces us to reconsider assumptions about visibility and authority. It reminds us that power is not always loud. Not always masculine. Not always public. Sometimes it is quiet, relational, procedural. Sometimes it moves through influence rather than decree. And sometimes, it disappears so gradually that only hindsight reveals its scale. Now, after all these hours of walking through corridors, real and remembered, we can step back fully. The Ottoman harem was not a single story. It was layered. Contradictory. Dynamic across centuries. It evolved from the early imperial period through the height of expansion, through the era historians call the Sultanate of Women, through reform and finally dissolution. It contained individual ambition and institutional constraint. It shaped urban landscapes through charitable foundations. It influenced diplomacy indirectly. It guarded succession relentlessly. And then, like all political systems rooted in dynasty, it yielded to modern nation-state transformation. But its echo remains. In scholarship. In art. In tourism. In debate. In the very word harem, which still carries weight far beyond its original administrative meaning. So if someone imagines only luxury and idleness, you now know the deeper structure beneath that image. If someone imagines only oppression, you know the strategic complexity layered within it. If someone imagines only intrigue, you recognize the bureaucracy sustaining it. History rarely offers simple verdicts. It offers complexity. And complexity requires patience. The lamps are long extinguished now. The palace stands as architecture. The dynasty rests in history. But the questions, about power, gender, narrative, and memory, remain very much alive. And that is why this story continues. Not because of fantasy. But because structure leaves shadows long after walls fall. Now, truly, we have reached the quiet end of the corridor. And there is nothing more to add, except the understanding that the story was never as simple as it seemed. Even at the end of the corridor, there is one final layer we have not fully unfolded. Because when we study the Ottoman harem across centuries, we are not only studying a palace institution. We are studying how power hides. How it protects itself. How it trains those within it to think in long arcs rather than short impulses. The women who entered the imperial harem as children did not know they were entering history. They entered a system. A system that would teach them discipline before desire. Hierarchy before ambition. Observation before speech. That training alone challenges modern assumptions. We often associate power with visibility, podiums, proclamations, public declarations. But the harem functioned on the opposite principle. Influence increased as visibility decreased. The Valide Sultan did not need to appear in public squares. Her authority moved through correspondence, patronage, mediation. A word spoken in private could redirect appointments. A carefully timed silence could shift favor. Power there was not theatrical. It was calibrated. This does not romanticize it. Restriction was real. Choice was limited. Freedom of movement was controlled. Lives were shaped by dynastic necessity rather than personal autonomy. But within those constraints, intelligence operated. Strategy operated. Adaptation operated. That tension, between confinement and capability, is what makes the institution historically compelling. It forces us to resist easy moral simplification. Now consider something else. The harem existed for over 400 years. Very few institutions in world history maintain continuity for that long without structural flexibility. It survived weak sultans and strong ones. Child rulers and warrior rulers. Court intrigue and administrative reform. It adjusted. Hierarchy shifted. Rules refined. Titles formalized. Even the architecture expanded and reorganized over time. Institutions that do not adapt collapse quickly. The harem endured because it was dynamic beneath its rigid surface. That duality is important. Rigidity in appearance. Flexibility in practice. And when the empire itself could no longer adapt fast enough to modern pressures, the harem's adaptability was no longer sufficient to preserve it. It had always existed to serve dynasty. When dynasty ended, so did its purpose. There was no organic path for it to transform into something else. Its foundation was genealogical continuity. Remove that foundation, and the structure becomes ceremonial shell. And shells do not survive revolutions. Yet even in disappearance, the harem shaped conversations about women and power in Islamic societies, in European imagination, and in modern Turkish historiography. It became case study. Symbol. Debate. Sometimes warning. Sometimes inspiration. Depending on who is telling the story. That alone proves its enduring weight. If it had been trivial indulgence, it would have faded quietly. Instead, it remains one of the most discussed institutions of the Ottoman world. Because it complicates us. It complicates how we think about gender roles in pre-modern empires. It complicates how we define political participation. It complicates how we understand privacy as a political tool. And perhaps that is the most lasting contribution of this story. It reminds us that power is not always where we expect it to be. It can sit behind carved screens. It can move through family networks. It can flow through patronage rather than proclamation. It can shape succession without signing decrees. And when historians finally uncover the layers, through archival fragments, architectural study, financial records, what emerges is not fantasy. It is structure. And structure, though less glamorous than legend, is far more influential. So now, after this long journey, through rise and decline, myth and archive, ceremony and reform, we do not end with spectacle. We end with understanding. The Ottoman harem was not a dreamscape of indulgence. Nor was it a simple prison. It was a political organism inside a dynastic state. Disciplined. Hierarchical. Strategic. Human. Its walls contained ambition, fear, loyalty, rivalry, learning, and resilience. Its corridors carried whispers that sometimes shaped empires. And when its doors closed for the final time, history did not forget. Because the questions it raises still matter. Who holds power when it is unseen? How does narrative distort institutions we do not enter? How do systems shape identity so deeply that even exile cannot erase their imprint? Those questions outlive marble. Outlive dynasty. Outlive empire. And that is where we finally rest. Not in fantasy. Not in scandal. But in the quiet recognition that behind every closed door in history, there is complexity waiting to be understood. Because the Ottoman harem was not an isolated curiosity in world history. It belonged to a broader tradition of royal households across civilizations, institutions designed to protect lineage, regulate succession, and stabilize dynastic continuity. In China, imperial courts operated their own inner palaces with layered hierarchy and strict protocol. In Mughal India, Zenana quarters served similar dynastic purposes. In European monarchies, though structured differently, queens' households formed powerful political networks behind ceremonial fronts. The Ottoman harem was distinct, but not unique. What made it remarkable was scale and endurance. Over centuries, it became refined into a system where personal proximity to the ruler translated into political leverage, but only within rules that constrained chaos. And perhaps that is the thread tying everything together. It was never randomness. It was regulation. Even rivalry was structured. Even ambition followed protocol. Even affection existed inside hierarchy. That level of design tells us something about the Ottoman worldview. Order was sacred. Continuity was paramount. Uncontrolled succession had shattered earlier Islamic empires. The Ottomans learned from that instability. The harem became one of their solutions. Not perfect. Not always humane by modern standards. But effective for its time. And time matters. It is easy to judge past institutions by present expectations. Harder, and more honest, to understand them within their historical framework. Inside those walls, women did not think of themselves as symbols for future debates. They thought about survival. About influence. About their children's futures. About avoiding mistakes. About gaining education. About positioning carefully. Their world was bounded, yes. But within those boundaries, life unfolded fully. Friendships formed. Mentorships shaped younger generations. Rituals marked seasons. Births brought hope. Deaths altered hierarchy. Routine persisted. History is not only war and reform. It is also daily repetition. And the Ottoman harem was built on repetition. Generations of young entrants trained by older women who themselves had once been trained. Knowledge passed quietly. Protocol preserved. Behavior refined. That is how institutions last centuries. Through continuity of instruction. When modern visitors step into museum halls, they see ornamentation. But the true architecture was behavioral. It lived in posture. In speech patterns. In deference. In controlled access. That invisible architecture may be the most fascinating of all. Because unlike tiles and domes, it leaves no physical trace. Only patterns in records. And echoes in memoirs. So if someone asks, what was the Ottoman harem really, the most honest answer is layered. It was a domestic space. It was a political arena. It was a training institution. It was a system of confinement. It was a pathway to influence. It was a mechanism of dynastic survival. It was all of these at once. And its contradictions are not flaws in our understanding. They are the reality of history itself. No institution survives 400 years without containing paradox. Strength and fragility. Security and fear. Privilege and restriction. Control and uncertainty. Now, if we truly stretch to the furthest horizon of this story, we see something even quieter. The Ottoman Empire ended. The harem ended. But questions about private influence, hidden networks, and gendered power structures remain alive in every modern political system. They simply wear different names. Behind boardroom doors. Inside political families. Within advisory circles. Power still operates in rooms the public does not enter. That continuity, across centuries and cultures, is perhaps the deepest legacy. The Ottoman harem is not just about the past. It is a reminder that power rarely resides only in official titles. That proximity matters. That institutions shape those who live within them. And that when those institutions dissolve, their imprint lingers in memory and myth. Now we have gone beyond walls. Beyond empire. Beyond even the word harem. What remains is a meditation on structure and influence. On how history hides complexity beneath stereotype. And on why patience is required to see clearly. There is no further corridor to walk. No deeper chamber to enter. Only the understanding that what seemed at first like fantasy was, in truth, an intricate system, disciplined, adaptive, human. And in that recognition, the story finally settles into stillness. We are tracing its afterlife. Because some institutions end in law, but continue in imagination. Even today, the word harem rarely brings to mind ledgers, tutors, or succession strategy. It evokes atmosphere. Mystery. Seclusion. Ornament. That persistent image shows how powerful narrative can be, sometimes stronger than documentation. But step back for a moment. Think about what we have uncovered across these long hours. An institution created to protect dynastic continuity. A structured hierarchy governed by rank and protocol. A system that educated women in language, religion, arts, and etiquette. A political ecosystem in which proximity to the ruler translated into measurable influence. A domestic space that doubled as administrative mechanism. And finally, an institution that dissolved not in scandal, but in structural political transformation. That arc, creation, refinement, endurance, adaptation, decline, mirrors the life cycle of empires themselves. The harem was not separate from the Ottoman state. It was a reflection of it. Disciplined. Layered. Sensitive to balance. Concerned with legitimacy. When legitimacy faltered, everything attached to it trembled. But here is one more quiet observation. The harem forces us to confront how history treats women's power. When influence operates indirectly, historians once dismissed it as gossip. When women shaped policy through mediation rather than office, earlier scholars minimized their role. Only recently has academic study begun to treat relational power as real power. That shift in scholarship changes everything. It allows figures like Hurrem Sultan and Kozum Sultan to be understood not as anomalies, but as actors within a system that allowed, and sometimes required, female authority in moments of succession crisis. It also reminds us that political systems are rarely as rigid as their public image suggests. There are always secondary channels. Informal networks. Trusted intermediaries. The Ottoman harem institutionalized that channel. It made proximity itself a political category. And proximity is still powerful today. That is why this story endures beyond marble halls and gilded domes. Because it teaches us to look for influence where visibility is low. To question assumptions about where decisions originate. To resist oversimplifying complex structures into caricature. The harem's legacy is not in cushions or courtly rumor. It is in the understanding that private space can shape public outcomes. That education within confinement can still produce agency. That hierarchy can both limit and enable. And that myths, once formed, can outlive realities by centuries. Now, after stretching this reflection as far as it can go, we arrive not at spectacle, but at clarity. The Ottoman harem was a guardian of succession. A school of protocol and refinement. A political arena behind walls. A structure built to prevent chaos. A space of both constraint and calculated opportunity. And when the Ottoman dynasty ended, it became a symbol for reformers. A fantasy for artists. A subject for historians. A mirror for debates about gender and power. That layered transformation is its true story. We began with misunderstanding. We moved through hierarchy and discipline. We watched reform and dissolution. We traced myth and re-evaluation. And now we end not with a dramatic image, but with a recognition. History is rarely what first appears. Behind every stereotype lies a structure. Behind every structure, human lives. Behind those lives, choices, constrained, strategic, imperfect, real. The Ottoman harem no longer exists as institution. But as historical inquiry, it remains alive. And perhaps that is the most fitting conclusion of all. Not fantasy. Not condemnation. Not nostalgia. But understanding. It is because there is one last quiet dimension to consider. Time. The Ottoman harem lasted longer than most modern nation-states have existed. Think about that. Generations were born, trained, aged, and died within a system that felt permanent. To those inside it, the structure was not historical. It was simply reality. That perspective changes everything. We often study the past knowing how it ends. They did not. A young girl entering the imperial harem in the 16th century could not imagine abolition in the 20th. The Valide Sultan advising her son during a succession crisis did not know that centuries later the dynasty itself would be legislated away. For them, the system was enduring. Stable. Divinely sanctioned. And that belief in permanence shaped behavior. When people believe a structure will last forever, they invest in mastering it. They refine its rules. They internalize its expectations. They build identity around it. That is why the harem became so psychologically powerful. It was not temporary confinement. It was a lifelong world. Now consider the emotional shock of its disappearance. In 1924, when members of the Ottoman dynasty were expelled from Turkey, women who had grown up within carefully layered hierarchy suddenly faced unfamiliar social orders. No ranks. No palace protocols. No guarded gates. Imagine moving from an environment where every interaction had scripted meaning to one where those scripts no longer applied. It was not just political exile. It was structural exile. Exile from the system that had shaped their instincts. That kind of transformation rarely appears in textbooks. But it matters. Because it reminds us that institutions are not abstract. They live inside people. And when they fall, something internal shifts too. There is also something else worth acknowledging. The Ottoman harem challenges the modern instinct to divide history into simple moral binaries. Oppressor versus oppressed. Freedom versus imprisonment. Empowerment versus confinement. The truth resists that neat division. There was confinement. There was control. There were limitations imposed by dynastic necessity. But there was also learning, influence, negotiation, and in some cases, extraordinary authority. Those realities coexisted. History often demands that we hold tension instead of resolution. The harem is one of those cases. It is uncomfortable because it refuses to be only one thing. It forces us to ask. Can agency exist within restriction? Can influence operate without public recognition? Can structure both protect and confine? Those are not only historical questions. They are human ones. Now, as we stretch to the farthest edge of reflection, we see something even broader. Every society creates inner circles. Spaces where decisions are shaped before they are announced. Rooms where trust matters more than title. Networks where proximity determines outcome. The Ottoman harem was one historical version of that universal phenomenon. It wore Ottoman architecture and Islamic court etiquette. But the underlying dynamic, controlled access to power, exists across cultures and eras. That recognition does not flatten its uniqueness. It deepens its relevance. Because it shows that the story we have been walking through is not just about a palace in Istanbul. It is about how humans organize authority. How they guard succession. How they respond to uncertainty. How they create systems to manage ambition. And how those systems eventually yield to change. Now there truly is nowhere further to go in this corridor. We have moved from structure to psychology. From politics to memory. From architecture to legacy. From myth to archive. The Ottoman harem began as a dynastic solution to instability. It evolved into a disciplined institution. It became misunderstood in art and literature. It declined with reform. It disappeared with revolution. And it survives today as a subject of study and debate. That complete arc is its story. Not a single dramatic moment. But centuries of quiet organization behind guarded walls. And perhaps that is the final truth. The most powerful forces in history are often the least theatrical. They do not shout. They endure. Until they don't. And when they vanish, we are left with echoes, and the work of understanding them properly. Now, finally, the corridor ends. And there is only stillness. Because the Ottoman harem is not only a subject. It is a test. A test of whether we are willing to look past spectacle. A test of whether we can hold complexity without forcing it into simple categories. When many people first hear the word, they imagine indulgence. When others study reformist critiques, they imagine oppression. When historians open archives, they find administration. All three perspectives contain fragments of truth. But none alone is sufficient. And that is the lesson. History punishes oversimplification. The harem was structured because the empire feared instability. Succession crises had fractured earlier states in the Islamic world. Brothers fought brothers. Dynasties collapsed from internal conflict. The Ottomans designed systems to reduce that risk. Controlled reproduction. Regulated access to heirs. Hierarchical management. It was not romantic design. It was political engineering. Seen through that lens, the harem becomes less mysterious and more strategic. But strategy does not erase humanity. Inside that engineered system were individuals with emotions, rivalries, hopes, disappointments, loyalties. Some found opportunity. Some endured limitation. Some rose to enormous influence. Some faded into anonymity. The archive remembers titles more easily than feelings. Yet feelings were there. Ambition does not require freedom to exist. It adapts to constraints. And that is another quiet insight. Human beings do not stop strategizing simply because walls surround them. They learn new methods. Indirect communication. Alliance building. Timing. Patience. In many ways, the harem was a school of political subtlety. That subtlety confuses modern observers who expect power to look public. But power often prefers privacy. Even today, decisions that shape millions may begin in small rooms among trusted circles. The Ottoman harem institutionalized that reality. It formalized proximity. It codified hierarchy. It trained participants to operate within strict boundaries while still pursuing influence. And when the modern Turkish Republic replaced dynasty with nation-state governance, that entire architecture of proximity was no longer required. The state shifted toward ministries, parliaments, legal codes. Authority moved from bloodline to bureaucracy. The harem belonged to bloodline politics. When bloodline politics ended, so did it. This transition is crucial. It shows that institutions are not eternal because they are strong. They endure only as long as the political system they serve endures. Change the foundation, and the structure dissolves. Yet the memory remains. Tourists walking through former palace chambers may not see political engineering. They see beauty. But beauty was never the purpose. Stability was. And stability, for centuries, was achieved. That achievement does not require celebration or condemnation. It requires understanding. So what remains after everything has been examined? Not fantasy. Not scandal. Not moral verdict. What remains is recognition. Recognition that behind every simplified historical label lies a web of structure and human adaptation. Recognition that women in pre-modern societies exercised power in forms not always recorded as official authority. Recognition that privacy and influence are often intertwined. Recognition that myths often reveal more about those who create them than about their subjects. And recognition that endings are rarely dramatic. They are administrative, legal, gradual. The Ottoman harem did not explode into disappearance. It faded with the dynasty it served. Its rooms still stand. Its routines do not. Its myths still circulate. Its records still wait in archives. That is how history survives. Not as spectacle, but as layers waiting to be read carefully. Now, truly, we have reached the final stillness.